I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today, I have to start with an apology. If you were looking to hear The Bridge Between Matter and Spirit is Matter Becoming Spirit by Paolo Soleri, or Deliverance from Error by El Ghazali, or The Book of Sages by Eliphas Levi, I'm sorry. I accidentally, permanently deleted them completely. So they will no longer be here. And I likely will not go back to them again, since I already spent a good time of my life reading them. But I might come back someday. Who knows? In any event, we are now at 14.1. And we're starting a new book called Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. His personal testament on art, action, and ritual death. Sun and Steel. Of late, I have come to sense within myself an accumulation of all kinds of things that cannot find adequate expression via an objective artistic form such as the novel. A lyric poet of 20 might manage it, but I am 20 no longer, and have never been a poet at any rate. I have groped around, therefore, for some other form more suited to such personal utterances, and have come up with a kind of hybrid between confession and criticism, a subtly equivocal mode that one might call confidential criticism. I see it as a twilight genre between the night of confession and the daylight of criticism. The eye with which I shall occupy myself will not be the eye that relates back strictly to myself, but something else, some residue, that remains after all the other words I have uttered have flowed back into me, something that neither relates back nor flows back. As I pondered the nature of that eye, I was driven to the conclusion that the eye in question corresponded precisely with the physical space that I occupied. What I was seeking, in short, was a language of the body. If myself was my dwelling, then my body resembled my orchard that surrounded it. I could either cultivate that orchard to its capacity or leave it for the weeds to run riot in. I was free to choose, but the freedom was not as obvious as it might seem. Many people indeed go so far as to refer to the orchards of their dwellings as destiny. One day it occurred to me to set about cultivating my orchard for all I was worth. For my purpose I used sun and steel. Unceasing sunlight and implements fashioned of steel became the chief elements in my husbandry. Little by little the orchard began to bear fruit, and thoughts of the body came to occupy a large part of my consciousness. All this did not occur, of course, overnight, nor did it begin without the existence of some deep-lying motive. When I examined closely my early childhood, I realized that my memory of words reaches back far farther than the memory of the flesh. In the average person, I imagine, the body precedes language. In my case, words came first of all, then, belatedly, with every appearance of extreme reluctance, and already clothed in concepts, came the flesh. It was already, as goes without saying, sadly wasted by words. First comes the pillar of plain wood, then the white ants that feed on it. But for me the white ants were there from the start, and the pillar of plain wood emerged tardily, already half eaten away. Let the reader not chide me for my comparing my own trade to the white ant. In its essence, any art that relies on words makes use of their ability to eat away, of their corrosive function, just as etching depends on the corrosive power of nitric acid. Yet the simile is not accurate enough, for the copper and nitric acid used in etching are on par with each other, both being extracted from nature, while the relation of words to reality is not that of the acid to the plate. Words are a medium that reduces reality to abstraction for transmission to our reason, and in the power to corrode reality inevitably lurks the danger that the words themselves will be corroded too. It might be more appropriate, in fact, to liken that action to that of excess stomach fluids that digest and gradually eat away the stomach itself. Many people will express disbelief that such a process could already be at work in a person's earliest years. But that, beyond doubt, is what happened to me personally, thereby laying the ground for two contradictory tendencies within myself. One was the determination to press ahead loyally with the corrosive function of words and to make that my life's work. The other was the desire to encounter reality in some field where words should play no part at all. In a more healthy process of development, the two tendencies can often work together, without conflict, even in the case of a born writer, giving rise to a highly desirable state of affairs in which training in words leads to a fresh discovery of reality. But the emphasis here is on rediscovery. If this is to happen, it is necessary at the outset of life to have possessed the reality of the flesh still unsullied by words. And that is quite different from what happened to me. My composition teacher would often show his displeasure with my work, which was innocent of any words that might be taken as corresponding to reality. It seems that in my childish way I had an unconscious presentiment of the subtle fastidious laws of words, and was aware of the necessity of avoiding as far as possible coming into contact with reality via words if one was to profit from their positive corrosive function and escape their negative aspect. If to put it more simply, one was to maintain the purity of words. I knew instinctively that the only possibility was to maintain a constant watch on the corrosive action lest it suddenly come up against some object that it might corrode. The natural corollary of such a tendency was that I should openly admit the existence of reality in the body only in fields where words had no part whatsoever. Thus reality in the body became synonymous for me, the objects almost of a kind of fetishism. Without doubt, too, I was quite unconsciously expanding my interest in words to embrace this interest also. And this type of fetishism corresponded exactly to the fetish for words. In the first stage, I was quite obviously identifying myself with words and setting reality, the flesh, in action on the other side. There's no doubt either that my prejudice concerning words was encouraged by this willfully created antinomy, and that my deep-rooted misunderstanding of the nature of reality, the flesh, and action was formed in the same way. This antinomy rested on the assumption that I myself from the outset was devoid of the flesh, of reality, of action. It was true, indeed, that the flesh came late to me at the beginning, but I was waiting for it with words. I suspect that because of the earlier tendency I spoke of, I did not perceive it then as my body. If I had done so, my words would have lost their purity. I should have been violated by reality, and reality would have become inescapable. Interestingly enough, my stubborn refusal to perceive the body was itself due to a beautiful misconception in my idea of what the body was. I did not know that a man's body never shows itself as existence. But as I saw things, it ought to have made itself apparent clearly and unequivocally as existence. It naturally followed that when it did show itself unmistakably as a terrified paradox of existence, as a form of existence that rejected existence, I was as panic-stricken as though I had come across some monster and loathed it accordingly. It never occurred to me that other men, all men without exception, were the same. It is perhaps only natural that this type of panic and fear, though so obviously the product of a misconception, should postulate another more desirable physical existence, another more desirable reality. Never dreaming that the body existing in a form that rejected existence was universal in the male, I set about constructing my ideal hypothetical physical existence by investing it with the opposite characteristics. And since my own abnormal bodily existence was doubtless a product of the intellectual corrosion of words, the ideal body, the ideal existence, must, I told myself, be absolutely free from any interference by words. Its characteristic could be summed up as taciturnity and beauty of form. At the same time, I decided that if the corrosive power of words was any creative function, it must find its model in the formal beauty of this ideal body, and that the ideal in the verbal arts must lie solely in the imitation of such physical beauty. In other words, the pursuit of a beauty that was absolutely free from corrosion. This was an obvious self-contradiction, since it represented an attempt to deprive words of their essential function and to strip reality of its essential characteristics. Yet, in another sense, it was an exceedingly clever and artful method of ensuring that words and the reality they should have dealt with never came face to face. In this way, my mind, without realizing what it was doing, straddled these two contradictory elements and, godlike, set about trying to manipulate them. It was thus that I started writing novels, and this increased still further my thirst for reality and the flesh. Moving on. Later. Much later. Thanks to the sun and the steel, I was to learn the language of the flesh, much as one might learn a foreign language. It was my second language, an aspect of my spiritual development. My purpose now is to talk of that development. As a personal history, it will, I suspect, be unlike anything seen before, and as such exceedingly difficult to follow. When I was small, I would watch the young men parade the portable shrine through the streets of the local shrine festival. They were intoxicated with their task, and their expressions were of an indescribable abandon, their faces averted. Some of them even rested the back of their necks against the shafts of the shrine they shouldered, so that their eyes gazed up at the heavens. And my mind was much troubled by the riddle of what it was that those eyes reflected. As to the nature of the intoxicating vision that I detected in all this violent physical stress, my imagination provided no clue. For many a month, therefore, the enigma continued to occupy my mind. It was only much later, after I had begun to learn the language of the flesh, that I understood to help in shouldering a portable shrine, and was at last able to solve the puzzle that had plagued me since infancy. They were simply looking at the sky. In their eyes there was no vision, only the reflection of the blue and absolute skies of early autumn. Those blue skies, though, were unusual skies, such as I might never see again in my life. One moment strung up high aloft, the next plunged to the depths, constantly shifting, a strange compound of lucidity and madness. I promptly set down what I had discovered in a short essay, so important did my experience seem to me. In short, I had found myself at a point where there were no grounds for doubting that the sky, that my own poetic intuition had shown me, and the sky revealed to the eyes of those ordinary young men of the neighborhood, were identical. That moment for which I had been waiting for so long was a blessing that the sun in the steel had conferred upon me. Why, you may ask, were there no grounds for doubt? Because, provided certain physical conditions are equal, and a certain physical burden shared, so long as an equal physical stress is savored, and an identical intoxication overtakes all alike, then differences of individual sensibility are restricted by countless factors to an absolute minimum. If, in addition, the introspective element is removed almost completely, then one is safe in asserting that what I had witnessed was no individual illusion, but one fragment of a well-defined group vision. My poetic intuition did not become a personal privilege until later, when I used words to recall and reconstruct that vision. My eyes, in their meeting with the blue sky, had penetrated to the essential pathos of the doer. And in that swaying blue sky that like a fierce bird of prey with wings outstretched alternately swept down and soared upwards to infinity, I perceived the true nature of what I had long referred to as tragic. According to my definition of tragedy, the tragic pathos is born when the perfectly average sensibility momentarily takes unto itself a privileged nobility that keeps others at a distance, and not when a special type of sensibility vaunts its own special claims. It follows that he who dabbles in words can create tragedy, but cannot participate in it. It is necessary, moreover, that the privileged nobility find its basis strictly in a kind of physical courage. The elements of intoxication and superhuman clarity in the tragic are born when the average sensibility, endowed with a given physical strength, encounters that type of privileged moment especially designed for it. Tragedy calls for an anti-tragic vitality and ignorance, and above all for a certain inappropriateness. If a person is at times to draw close to the divine, then under normal conditions he must be neither divine nor anything approaching it. It was only when I, in my turn, saw the strange divine blue sky perceived only by that type of person, that I at last trusted the universality of my own sensibility, that my thirst was slaked, and that my morbidly blind faith in words was dispelled. At that moment I participated in the tragedy of all being. Once I had gazed upon this sight, I understood all kinds of things hitherto unclear to me. The exercise of the muscles elucidated the mysteries that words had made. It was similar to the process of acquiring erotic knowledge. Little by little, I began to understand the feeling behind existence and action. If that were all, it would merely mean that I had trodden somewhat belatedly the same path as other people. I had another scheme of my own, however. In so far as the spirit was concerned, I told myself, there was nothing especially out of the way in the idea of some particular thought invading my spirit, enlarging it, and eventually occupying the whole of it. Since, however, I was gradually beginning to be too weary of the dualism of flesh and spirit, it naturally occurred to me to wonder why such an incident should occur within the spirit and come to an end at its outer fringes. There are, of course, many cases of psychosomatic diseases where the spirit extends its domain to the body, but what I was considering went further than this. Granted that my flesh in infancy had made itself apparent in intellectual guise, corroded by words, then should it not be possible to reverse the process? To extend the scope of an idea from the spirit to the flesh until the whole physical being became a suit of armor forged from the metal of that concept? The idea in question, as I have already suggested in my definition of tragedy, resolved itself into the concept of the body, and it seemed to me that the flesh should be intellectualized to a higher degree, could achieve a closer intimacy with ideas than the spirit. For ideas are, in the long run, essentially foreign to human existence, and the body, receptacle of the involuntary muscles of the internal organs and circulatory system over which it has no control, is foreign to the spirit, so that it is even possible for people to use the body as a metaphor for ideas, both being something quite alien to human existence as such. And the way in which an idea can take possession of the mind unbidden, with the suddenness of a stroke of fate, reinforces still further the resemblance of ideas to the body with which each of us willy-nilly is endowed, giving even this automatic, uncontrollable function a striking resemblance to the flesh. It is this that forms the basis of the idea of the enfleshment of Christ, and also the stigmata some people can produce on their palms and insteps. Nevertheless, the flesh has its limitations. Even should some eccentric idea require that a man sprout a pair of formidable horns on his head, they would obviously refuse to grow. The limiting factors ultimately are the harmony and balance on which the body insists. All these do is to provide beauty to the most average kind, and the physical qualifications necessary for viewing that swaying sky of the shrine bearers. They also, it seems, fulfill the function of taking revenge on and correcting any excessively eccentric idea. And they constantly draw one back to the point at which there is no longer any room to doubt one's identity with others. In this way, my body, while itself the product of an idea, would doubtless have also serve as the best cloak with which to hide the idea. If the body could achieve perfect, non-individual harmony, then it would be possible to shut individuality up forever in close confinement. I had always felt that such signs of physical individuality as a bulging belly or a flat chest with protruding ribs were excessively ugly, and I could not contain my surprise when I discovered that there were people who loved such signs. To me, these could only seem acts of shameless indecency, as though the owner were exposing his spiritual pudenta on the outside of his body. They represented one type of narcissism that I could never forgive. The theme of the estrangement of body and spirit, born of the craving I have described, persisted for a long time as a principal theme in my work. I only came to take gradual leave of it when I last began to consider whether it was not possible that the body too might have its own logic, possibly even its own thought, when I began to feel that the body's special qualities did not lie solely in taciturnity and beauty of form, but that the body too might have its own loquacity. When I describe in this fashion the shifts in these two trains of thought, the reader will surely say that I merely start by taking what were, if anything, generally accepted premises, and get involved in a maze of illogicality. The estrangement of body and spirit in modern society is an almost universal phenomenon, and there is nobody, the reader may feel, who would fail to deplore it. So that to prate emotionally about the body thinking or the loquacity of the flesh is going too far, and by using such phrases I am merely covering up my own confusion. In fact, by setting my fetish for reality and physical existence and my fetish for words on the same level, by making them an exact equation, I had already brought into sight the discovery I was to make later. From the moment I set the wordless body full of physical beauty in opposition to beautiful words that imitated physical beauty, thereby equating them as two things springing from one and the same conceptual source, I had in effect, without realizing it, already released myself from the spell of words. For it meant that I was recognizing the identical origin of the formal beauty in the wordless body and the formal beauty in words, and was beginning to seek a kind of Platonic idea that would make it possible to put the flesh and words on the same footing. At that stage, the attempt to project words onto the body was already only a stone's throw away. The attempt itself, of course, was strikingly unplatonic, but there remained only one more experience for me to pass through before I could start to talk of the ideas of the flesh and the loquacity of the body. Or perhaps locucity. L-O-Q-U-A-C-I-T-Y. In order to explain what that was, I must start by describing the encounter between myself and the sun. In fact, this experience occurred on two occasions. It often happens that, long before the decisive meeting with a person from whom only death can thereafter part one, there's a brief brush elsewhere with that same person, occurring with almost total unawareness on both sides. So it was with my encounter with the sun. My first unconscious encounter was in the summer of the defeat in the year 1945. A relentless sun blazed down on the lush grass of that summer that lay on the borderline between the war and the post-war period. A borderline, in fact, that was nothing more than a line of barbed wire entanglements half broken down, half buried in the summer weeds, tilting in all directions. I walked in the sun's rays, but had no clear understanding in the meaning they held for me. Fine-spun and impartial, the summer sunlight poured down prodigally on all creation alike. The war ended, yet the deep green weeds were lit exactly as before by the merciless light of noon, a clearly perceived hallucination stirring in a slight breeze. Brushing the tips of the leaves with my fingers, I was astonished that they did not vanish at my touch. That same sun, as the days turned to months and the months turned to years, had become associated with pervasive corruption and destruction. In part, it was the way it gleamed so encouragingly on the wings of planes leaving on missions, on forests of bayonets, on the badges of military caps, and on the embroidery of military banners. But still more, far more, it was the way it glistened on the blood flowing ceaselessly from the flesh, and on the silver bodies of flies clustering on wounds, holding sway over corruption, leading youth in droves to its death in tropical seas and countrysides. The sun lorded it over that vast rusty red ruin that stretched away to the distant horizon. I little dreamed, since the sun had never been dissociated from the image of death, that it could ever confer on me a bodily blessing, even though it had, of course, long harbored images of radiant glory. I was already 15, and I had written a poem. And still the light pours down, men laud the day. I shun the sun and cast my soul into the shadowy pit. How dearly indeed I loved my pit, my dusky room, the area of my desk with its piles of books. How I enjoyed introspection, shrouded myself in cogitation. With what rapture did I listen for the rustling of frail insects in the thickets of my nerves. A hostility toward the sun was my only rebellion against the spirit of the age. I hankered after Novalis' night in Yeatsian Irish twilights. However, from the time the war ended, I gradually sensed that an era was approaching in which to treat the sun as an enemy would be tantamount to following the herd. The literary works written or put before the public around that time were dominated by night thoughts, though their night was far less aesthetic than mine. To be really respected at that time, moreover, one's darkness had to be rich and cloying, not thin. Even the rich, honeyed night in which I myself had wallowed in my boyhood seemed to them, apparently, very thin stuff indeed. Little by little, I began to feel uncertain about the night in which I had placed such trust during the war, and to suspect that I might have belonged with the sun worshippers all along. It may well have been so, and if it was indeed so, I began to wonder, might not my persistent hostility toward the sun and the continued importance I attached to my own small private night be no more than a desire to follow the herd? The men who indulged in nocturnal thought, it seemed to me, had without exception dry, lusterless skins and sagging stomachs. They sought to wrap up a whole epoch in a capacious night of ideas, and rejected in all its forms the sun that I had seen. They rejected both life and death as I had seen them, for in both of these the sun had had a hand. Moving on. It was 1952 on the deck of the ship on which I made my first journey abroad, and I exchanged a reconciliatory handshake with the sun. From that day on, I have found myself unable to part company with it. The sun became associated with the main highway of my life, and little by little it tanned my skin brown, branding me as a member of the other race. One might object that thought belongs essentially to the night. That creation with words is of necessity carried out in the fevered darkness of night. Indeed, I had still not lost my old habit of working through the small hours, and I was surrounded by people whose skins unmistakably bore witness to nocturnal thinking. Yet why must it be that men always seek out the depths, the abyss? Why must thoughts, like a plumb line, concern itself exclusively with vertical descent? Why was it not feasible for thought to change direction and climb vertically up, ever up toward the surface? Why should the area of the skin, which guarantees a human being's existence in space, be most despised and left to the tender mercies of the senses? I could not understand the laws governing the motion of thought, the way it was liable to get stuck in unseen chasms whenever it set out to go deep, or whenever it aimed to the heights to soar away into boundless and equally invisible heavens, leaving the corporeal form undeservedly neglected. If the law of thought is that it should search out profundity, whether it extends upward or downwards, then it seems excessively illogical to me that men should not discover depths of a kind in the surface, that vital borderline that endorses our separateness from our form, dividing our exterior from our interior. Why should they not be attracted by the profundity of the surface itself? The sun was enticing, almost dragging my thoughts away from their night of visceral sensations, away to the swelling of muscles encased in sunlit skin. It was commanding me to construct a new and sturdy dwelling in which my mind, as it rose little by little to the surface, could live in security. That dwelling was a tanned, lustrous skin and powerful, sensitively rippling muscles. I came to feel that it was precisely because such an abode was required that the average intellectual failed to feel at home with thought that concerned itself with forms and surfaces. The nocturnal outlook, product of diseased inner organs, is given shape almost before its owner is aware which came first, the outlook itself, or those first faint morbid symptoms in the inner organs, and yet in remote recesses invisible to the eye, the body slowly creates and regulates its own thought. With the surface, on the other hand, which is visible to everybody, training of the body must take precedence over training of thought if it is to create and supervise its own ideas. The need for me to train my body could not have been foreseen from that moment when I first felt the attraction, the surface profundities. I was aware that the only thing that could justify such an idea was muscle. Who pays any attention to a physical education theorist grown decrepit? One might accept the pallid scholar's toying with nocturnal thoughts in the privacy of his study, but what could seem more meager, more chilly than his lips were to speak, whether in praise or in blame, of the body? So well acquainted was I with the poverty of that type, that one day quite suddenly it occurred to me to acquire ample muscles of my own. I would draw attention here to one fact, that everything as this shows proceeded from my mind. I believe that just as physical training will transform supposedly involuntary muscles into voluntary ones, so a similar transformation can be achieved through training the mind. Both body and mind, through an inevitable tendency that one might almost call a natural law, are inclined to lapse into automatism. But I have found by experience that a large stream may be deflected by digging a small channel. This is another example of the quality that our spirits and body have in common, that tendency shared by the body and the mind to instantly create their own small universe, their own false order. Whenever at one particular time they are taken control of one particular idea, although what happens in fact represents a kind of standstill, it is experienced as though it were a burst of lively centripetal activity. This function of the body and mind in creating for a short while with their own minute universes is in fact no more than an illusion, yet the fleeting sense of happiness in human life owes much to precisely this type of false order. It's a kind of protective function of life in face of chaos around it, and resembles the way a hedgehog rolls itself up into a tight round ball. The possibility then presented itself of breaking down one type of false order and creating another in its place, of turning back on itself this obstinate formative function and resetting it in a direction that better accorded with one's own aims. This idea I decided I would immediately put into action. Rather than idea, though, I might have said the new purpose which the sun provided me with each day. It was thus that I found myself confronted with those lumps of steel, heavy, foreboding, cold, as though the essence of night had in them been still further condensed. Thus concludes section 14.1 of Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. Next time we will continue with section 14.2 of the same. I will see you then. Alam.